When you think about concentration camps, the first thought might be Nazi Germany or the infamous Unit 731 in Japan. But did you know America had its own concentration camp?
Hear their stories. You will now see a few of the sights we saw.
And its story, so horrifying that it's been wiped from history. This is the story of the Devil's Punch Bowl in Natchez, Mississippi. From above, it looks like a dense jungle. From the ground, it's a green forest waiting to be explored. But hidden here is a dark secret, intentionally ignored by historians and the media: America's death camps. Thousands of freed African Americans were forced into this camp and treated horribly. Experts estimate that in just 1 year, more than 20,000 freed people died here. Yet much of this history remains a mystery. In schools, we learn that in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved African Americans in Confederate states. Later, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment ended slavery everywhere in the US. This was the start of freedom, but it wasn't that simple. In the South, slavery had been the backbone of the economy. There were 4 million enslaved people who kept the Confederate war effort going. After they were freed, many African Americans faced a new struggle: racism and violence. Southern states quickly passed black codes, laws meant to restrict the rights of freed black people. These laws allowed African Americans to own property and marry, but denied them other basic rights, like testifying against white people or serving on juries. Many were forced to work for white landowners under unfair contracts. Those who refused were arrested or even forced into labor. After the war, life was still very hard for black Americans in the South. Most lived in poverty and had little access to education or fair jobs. Many became sharecroppers, renting land from former enslavers and giving a share of their crops as payment. Some freed slaves managed to take land, but federal troops soon returned it to white landowners. In the years after the war, thousands of freed people left the South, looking for freedom and safety. Some ended up in Natchez, Mississippi, but many of them disappeared, never seen again. They left behind plantations and rural poverty, hoping to find safety and opportunities elsewhere. When they made their way to Natchez, Mississippi, a city that became a symbol of hope for newly freed people, the Natchez population exploded almost overnight, swelling from 10,000 residents to over 120,000 as freed people poured into the area. But the city was unprepared to handle this sudden influx. With limited resources and growing tensions between black and white residents, Union soldiers stationed in Natchez devised a grim solution. They decided to confine the freed African Americans in a makeshift camp, a natural hollow known as the Devil's Punch Bowl. What started as a temporary measure quickly became a nightmare. The camp was surrounded by steep cliffs, making it almost impossible to escape. Soldiers guarded the area, ensuring that no one could leave. Conditions inside were horrific. Men were forced to perform grueling labor under the sweltering Mississippi sun. The heat, combined with a lack of food and water, led to dehydration and exhaustion. Women and children fared no better. They were left to starve or succumb to diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. One of the deadliest diseases in the camp was smallpox, a highly contagious virus that caused fever, fatigue, and painful sores. With no access to medical care, the disease spread like wildfire, killing countless people. Survivors were forced to bury the dead where they fell, creating mass graves that still haunt the site today. The Devil's Punch Bowl is said to contain 3 mass graves, holding the remains of thousands of men, women, and children who died there. Local residents claim that after heavy rains, bones sometimes resurface, a chilling reminder of the lives lost. Wild peach trees also grew in the area, but many locals refused to eat the fruit, believing it to be nourished by the blood of those who perished. The story of the Devil's Punch Bowl is not just a tale of suffering. It's a stark example of how systemic racism continued to oppress African Americans even after slavery was abolished. Despite being legally free, many black people were treated as less than human, confined, and exploited under the guise of refugee camps.
It's finally Friday again, and as we head into the weekend, we head out with Walt Grayson as he goes about Mississippi exploring places we may or may not be familiar with. And Walt, you have a story about a place most of us have never seen.
Oh, I wouldn't think so. Maybe from the road for the hardy adventurer, but we get to go down inside the Devil's Punch Bowl, just north of Natchez.
It looks like a jungle from up above. Down below that first bluff east of the Mississippi River, quarter mile, maybe a half mile past Natchez City Cemetery. You're 200 feet up right here, and your footing falls almost straight down into a two-pronged indentation into the bluffs that sort of looks like the roots on a molar tooth. The moderate seclusion it afforded from boats on the river just below it and travelers on Cemetery Road just above it gave rise to all sorts of rumors and legends of dastardly deeds that were supposed to have happened in here.
While the story of the Devil's Punch Bowl is widely told in local folklore, it remains controversial amongst historians. Some argue that the site was not a concentration camp, but a poorly managed refugee camp where conditions were harsh for everyone, including white residents and Union soldiers. The suppression of this aspect of American history was because of the political situation after the Civil War, the racial tensions of Reconstruction, and the desire to maintain a particular version of history. After the Civil War, the United States entered the Reconstruction era, a time of supposed rebuilding and integration of freed African Americans into society. However, in reality, Reconstruction was marked by resistance from the South, which sought to regain economic and social control over black communities. The story of thousands of freed African Americans perishing in a Union-controlled internment camp did not fit the narrative of a victorious and benevolent Union army that had fought for their freedom. The South, on the other hand, was engaged in rewriting its own history through the Lost Cause movement, which sought to glorify the Confederacy while downplaying the atrocities committed against African Americans. Any acknowledgement of the Devil's Punch Bowl would have contradicted the image of Southern plantation life being benevolent and black people being better off under slavery. Furthermore, historical documentation was scarce. Unlike major Civil War battles which were recorded and analyzed, the events at the Devil's Punch Bowl were not widely reported in newspapers, military reports, or government records. Many of the freedmen who suffered there were illiterate, leaving few first-hand accounts. Oral histories from descendants and local communities would later serve as some of the only surviving records of what truly happened. With limited documentation, deliberate historical erasure, and an unwillingness by both the North and South to address this tragedy, the Devil's Punch Bowl faded. It became one of the many untold stories of African American suffering during and after the war, stories that were buried for years. Many of these narratives persisted well into the 20th century, influencing how the Civil War was taught in schools and how African American history was marginalized. It was not until the Civil Rights Movement, and later, efforts by black historians and scholars that the truth behind such hidden histories began to emerge. The tragedy of the Devil's Punch Bowl did not end with the deaths of thousands of freed African Americans. Its effects rippled across generations, leaving lasting scars on black communities. One of the most devastating impacts was the loss of lineage. Many of the men, women, and children who perished in the camp had no proper records of their deaths, and their bodies were never given marked graves. Families were permanently separated, and entire bloodlines were erased. The trauma of this loss was passed down through generations. As many African American families today struggle to trace their ancestry due to the lack of documentation from this era, Descendants of enslaved people and those who suffered in these post-war camps often experience a deep, inherited pain. This trauma manifests in different ways, including distrust of government institutions, economic struggles, and a deep sense of loss regarding their ancestral heritage. The Devil's Punch Bowl serves as a symbol of how freed African Americans were continuously betrayed by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. The Union Army, which had fought to end slavery, ultimately contributed to the suffering of those it had liberated. The tragedy was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of systemic oppression that defined the post-Civil War era for freed African Americans. While the end of slavery was a great victory, true freedom remained elusive. The suffering endured by those trapped in the Devil's Punch Bowl mirrored the struggles of millions of formerly enslaved people who faced a society determined to keep them in a state of subjugation. As we work to uncover the truth about the Devil's Punch Bowl, the recognition of this tragedy is crucial, not only to honor those who perished, but also to acknowledge the long-term impact that historical injustices have had on Black communities in America. If you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like, share, comment, and also, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and we'll see you next time.